Very nice. Beautiful analogy. I think it fits in so beautifully, which brings me to my last question, which is really, are agencies prepared for this change?
I think honestly, if I had to say, look at it from that lens, when we're looking at brands today cannot exist in isolation. They need partners, right? Because you cannot have all expert. Marketing branding is a very diverse field and is getting even more diverse. New technologies are being introduced, new methodologies are being, frameworks are being adopted. So nobody can be an expert in everything. So you do need partners. I think most brand and agency relationships, they really start strong, but they tend to fizzle out, right? Uh, and that's because initially you've got, like, you have this shared vision, you have a belief that this partnership is, going to really do wonders. But give it about 6 months, 8 months, on that honeymoon phase tends to kind of fade. And there are a number of reasons for this, but the brand eventually begins to think that, this agency just doesn't get us, doesn't get our customer, doesn't get our product. The agency feels that, oh, this client is really rigid, they're unwilling to explore bold ideas. So eventually what happens is, instead of pushing for a 9 or a 10 out of 10, everybody kind of settles for a 6, right? And a 6 out of 10. And so what you're left with is a lot of work that is very functional, right? But it's uninspiring. I've actually had the opportunity to sit on both sides of that table, right, throughout my career. I think about half of my work has been on the brand side, the other half has been on the agency side. And I've seen where great partnerships thrive, and I've also seen where they break down. On the one hand, I think brands expect that their agencies are going to be fortune tellers. Marketing today is the kind of field that is evolving so fast. It's almost like a breakneck speed. Today, we're in the age of generative AI, so we're talking about AI driven ads. We have new social platforms that are kind of mushrooming. We see consumer behavior that's kind of changing as new platforms become available. And for brands are kind of pressuring, they want their agencies to kind of master these things overnight, and they expect that often without providing, very clear business context about why is this even important for my, for my business. And so the agencies that actually do well, they're not just interpreting a trend. Agencies who do well here are the ones who are able to get, inside access to the company's insights, to the customer's pain points, and to the company's, like, strategic priorities. Only when they are able to do that, when they have that partnership, can they create meaningful work. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that agencies also feel that brands do not appreciate the chaos that they are dealing with. If you're an agency today, and, as someone who's worked in an agency, you know, right, you're juggling multiple clients, you're constantly pivoting between one industry to another, you're juggling deadlines, you're juggling creative revisions, right? And every client today who's sitting on the other side of the table thinks that their brand should be the priority, but so does every other brand that's on the agency's roster. And what you really need is a partnership mindset, something that where there is the mutual respect for each other, the skills and expertise that they bring to the table, and also for the working styles. Because the way agencies work is not the way that brands work, right? Uh, I think probably the third area is that on both sides, both brands and agencies, there is a fear of failure. Brands will say that they want, really bold innovation, but that only works if that success is going to be guaranteed. On the other hand, agencies say that they want a lot of creative freedom, right? But they're also at the same time fearful that they might lose an account if they push too hard. So this, this brings them sometimes at loggerheads, and it kind of results in a diluted, like, a risk-averse, approach to marketing, and that ultimately is going to fall flat with customers. And this is not something that impacts only a few or just the majority and their exceptions. I think even the greatest brands, have deal with exactly the same things. Like I think one of the seminal stories for me when you read Walter Isaacson's biography of Steve Jobs, right? They talk about Apple has this commercial called 1984, which they published at the Super Bowl, and today it's touted as one of the most legendary ad films ever created. Some publication have said it's the greatest single TV commercial ever created. And everybody looks at that commercial as an example of a brand making bold bets and making bold choices. But what most people don't really know, and what I didn't know before until I read the book, was that Apple almost killed that commercial before it actually went to air. Right? The executives, when they saw it, many of the executives who saw it hated it. They hated it so much that they actually had bought a Super Bowl slot and they tried to sell it back. They're like, hey, listen, cancel our slot. We cannot run this commercial. Right? And it really took a few people, right? On the one hand, the agency. At that point, I think Chai Tay was the agency. They kind of held their ground.
Yeah.
Right? They held their ground. They were asked to give the slot back. They didn't. Right? They held on to it. And in between, you had a few executives. Steve Wozniak, who was the co-founder with Steve Jobs, he loved the ad so much. He said, you know what? I am going to fund it out of my own personal money if I have to. Right? So only when they really kind of stood their ground were they able to convince the board, and that time the board only let them run the ad twice. It ran once during the Super Bowl and it ran one other time just so that it could be eligible for an award. Right? But this thing, the most iconic ad in television history has only been run once because the brand that ran the ad wasn't confident enough about the ad itself. Right? So this fear of failure is a very real thing. Right? I think the best campaigns kind of come out when both sides kind of co-own the problem. In the case of 1984, really that's what happened, right? You have the agency on the one hand who decides to take the risk and say, listen, we're not going to sell that slot back. Right? And you have, on the other hand, the founders, co-founders, or the executives who say, like, listen, we will take that risk. Even if it's just one thing, but it's 68 million people are going to see this ad. But we will take this risk.
Yeah.
Right? It's a calculated risk. And you fight at the end of the day for a business-driven creative, not just creative for its own sake. Right? It has to be business-driven creative. And when that happens, that's when you have great partnership. Right? Because great partnership is supposed to challenge and elevate the other person, not just yourself. Right? So I think for agencies and brands to kind of go beyond the transactional, instead of just like settling for sixes and not trying to go for a 9 or a 10, they need to start thinking of each other as strategic co-creators. You cannot have a agency vendor and buyer relationship. You have to invest in that relationship and say, okay, fine, I'm going to treat you as someone who you have to be willing to understand what's on the other side of the table. Brands need to understand what agencies go through. Agencies also need to spend time and invest time in what brands are going through. They can't be sitting back and waiting for a brief. Right? Get into the skin of your client's customer, walk in their shoes, and then come out with insight. I heard this really fascinating story of a couple of months ago from a CPG company talking about how they were trying to sell talcum powder. Right? They had called their agencies for a creative briefing, but before they did, it was a very fancy hotel in South Bombay. Before they did, I think the presentation was supposed to start at 2 o'clock in the afternoon or 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but everybody was called in by 12:30 or 1, and they had arranged this really nice horse-drawn carriage which would go down Marine Drive. Okay, in Mumbai, which is like an iconic balustrade across, in South Mumbai, with sea facing.
Yeah.
And they made them all sit in that horse-drawn carriage, and they all the creative partners kind of went on that. But it was, the height of the afternoon. So you're sitting there and you're thinking, okay, fine, I've got this really lovely thing, but it's really bloody hot. And at that point, everybody went through this thing, and it was maybe 20-30 minutes. I don't know exactly how long, but it was long enough that they all reached the hotel and they're all very uncomfortable. Right? I've come for this presentation. I'm meeting executives, very high powered executives at a very large, well known, well regarded brand, but I'm sweating now. I'm wiping my forehead. I'm not feeling very comfortable. It's been a hot summer's day. And at that point, really, the client said, okay, the product that we are selling is talcum powder. The bulk of our customers who use this talcum powder, okay, have to deal with these conditions. Okay. Now I want you to come up with how you think this product is going to help my customer. Right? So that point, it was brand orchestrated. But the idea is that, yes, you can't be sitting in an ivory tower and thinking about what the customer meant. You have to walk in their shoes in order to be able to understand, in order to be able to maybe give feedback that the brand says, yeah, this resonates or rings of truth, because this agency understands what my customers face and what my customers go through. So it's about fostering that partnership.
Beautiful. I think the examples were very, very nice. So I'm going to end our conversation with a couple of
Sure.
rapid fire questions.